What if the people who laughed at your deepest humiliation never saw you coming? Welcome to the archive. Today we're dissecting a story of perfect methodical revenge. If you enjoy seeing a plan come together, do me a favor and hit that like button, share this with a friend, and subscribe for more deep dives into complex narratives, because you are not going to want to miss a single step of this. This isn't a story about a simple fight. It's about a complete foreclosure. Stay with me until the very end to witness how a series of miracles, like saving a company, paying off a debt, and even a message from the grave, were actually a calculated poison designed for total psychological ruin. Let's begin. The world's full of stories about the black sheep. My family wrote one for me ending with a plane ticket and a chorus of laughter. But I'm writing the last chapter. They think they're living the high life. In reality, they're just ghosts in a house I've already foreclosed on. It begins, as these things so often do, in a room that smells of old paper and ambition. My grandfather's will reading. The air in that office was thick enough to choke on, a cocktail of feigned sorrow and the metallic tang of avarice. I remember the way the leather of the chairs groaned under the shifting weight of my family members. My father, Richard, tapping his pen against a polished mahogany table, the rhythmic clicks a frantic metronome for his greed. My mother, Eleanor, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. My brother, Mark, and sister Chloe, flanking them like a pair of well-dressed vultures, their eyes darting towards the lawyer Mr. Abernathy, as if trying to physically pull the words from his throat. I sat apart from them. By the window. The separation was more than just physical. It was a chasm that had been widening for years. They were there to witness the transfer of a kingdom. I was there to say goodbye to the king. He was the only one who had ever bothered to look past the quiet, unassuming facade they had assigned to me. The family archivist, that was my title. A dusty administrative role they thought was a fitting cage for the daughter who didn't reflect their particular brand of polished ruthlessness. They saw it as a chore. For me, it was a sanctuary. For years, I had lived within the paper catacombs of my grandfather's life, organizing his letters, his journals, his financial records. It wasn't a duty, it was a conversation. And through that silent dialogue, I learned everything. I developed a forensic understanding of our family's architecture, the public-facing marble columns and the crumbling, rot-filled foundations. I saw every secret loan, every vanity project bleeding money, every meticulously crafted lie that held their gilded world together. My grief that day was a solitary island in their ocean of anticipation. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose loyalty had a price tag my father had met long ago, cleared his throat and began to read. His voice was a droning, passionless river of legal jargon, carrying the assets of a lifetime to their predetermined shore. The flagship company, the portfolio of properties, the ancestral home that was more museum than house, the heirlooms that served as props in their performance of generational wealth, it all went to them. The visible, impressive burdens of a legacy they had done nothing to build. I expected nothing. Truly. My grandfather and I had our understanding. But I didn't expect the cruelty. Abernathy paused, adjusting his glasses. And to my granddaughter, Jessica, the room held its breath. My father's pen stopped clicking. Who has been a loyal caretaker and archivist, I leave the sum of $10,000. He let the paltry amount hang in the air, a deliberate insult. And one first-class, one-way ticket to any destination of her choosing. The plane ticket. That was my father's touch. An artist's flourish of contempt. A message, clear and sharp. You are not part of this. Go away. Disappear. The silence that followed was broken by a sound I will carry with me until I die. Laughter. It wasn't a single burst, but a wave that started as a snicker from my brother Mark. See? He said, his voice slick with condescension. Grandpa knew you weren't cut out for this. Then my father joined in, a low, rumbling chuckle of pure, triumphant relief. My mother offered only a smile, a saccharine, pitying little curve of the lips that was somehow more venomous than the rest. They weren't just disinheriting me. They were publicly ratifying my worthlessness. At the moment of my deepest grief, they held up a mirror to show me the failure they had always believed me to be. I stood up. My legs felt like they were moving through water. I didn't look at them. I couldn't. I walked to the table, took the ticket from a smirking Abernathy, and left the room. The sound of their laughter followed me down the hall, an echoing chorus that became the soundtrack to my rebirth. They didn't know. Of course they didn't know. They had never truly looked at me, so how could they see what I was holding? Not the ticket. Not the insult. But the key, the true will, was safe, tucked away in a file marked Genealogy Records 1880-1920, a place I knew they would never, ever look. My grandfather was a brilliant man, not just in business, but in his understanding of human nature. He had spent his last years liquidating quiet assets, moving his real fortune, a massive, staggering fortune built on secret early tech investments, into a labyrinth of offshore accounts. All of it under my sole control. His final letter to me was simple. "They will show you who they are," he wrote. "Believe them. And then use this to build a life they can never touch." He wanted me to be free. But as I sat in a cheap, anonymous apartment a week after the funeral, the sound of their laughter still ringing in my ears, I realized freedom wasn't enough. Justice was a prerequisite. Conventional justice, of course, was a fantasy. Our family wasn't just a part of the community. It was the community's center of gravity. The judges were golfing buddies with my father. The chief of police was a regular at their Christmas parties. The society papers chronicled their every move. To challenge them legally would have been an act of self-immolation. They would have deployed their vast social capital to paint me as unhinged, a bitter, grasping hysteric. I would have been buried under a mountain of legal fees and public ridicule. They controlled the board. They played the game with loaded dice. I spread the documents out on my floor. The statements detailing their company's precarious debt, Mark's gambling markers, the structural deficit in my mother's charity. I saw the truth of them, written in numbers. They weren't titans. They were hollow men, propped up by a name they hadn't earned, living in a house of cards. And that's when I understood. Taking their money, exposing them, that would be a clean, simple amputation. They would be ruined, yes, but they would understand their enemy. They would have something to fight against, to rage at. It would be a transaction. My revenge needed to be more profound. It had to be a work of art, tailored to their very souls. They worshipped two things, money and their own reflection. So I decided I would give them both, in overwhelming abundance. I would not be an attacker. I would be a mirror, a moral mirror. I would use this vast, invisible fortune not to ruin them, but to save them again and again. I would become their anonymous divine benefactor, bestowing upon them miracles they didn't earn and couldn't explain. I would trap them in a gilded cage of their own desires, and watch as the weight of their unearned success and the ghost of their crime made them turn on each other. I would not serve them a dish. I would simply set the table and let them devour themselves. My first move was aimed at the heart of their identity, the company. Sterling Industries, a name that was once synonymous with integrity under my grandfather, but which my father had leveraged into a bloated, debt-ridden caricature of success. I knew from the quarterly reports I had archived that they were facing a catastrophic failure. A hostile takeover from a rival firm was imminent. They were weeks from ruin, a secret they guarded with terrified ferocity. From a laptop in a quiet Zurich cafe, I began to build the mechanism. A series of shell corporations, nested within one another like Russian dolls, based in jurisdictions that prized anonymity above all else. It took 2 weeks to construct the labyrinth. Then I waited. I watched the financial news, tracking the predator as it circled. I let them sweat. I let them feel the abyss yawning at their feet. I wanted them to be standing on the absolute precipice. Then, at the 11th hour, the day before the final shareholder vote that would have stripped them of everything, the miracle arrived. A massive anonymous infusion of capital materialized in their corporate accounts. An amount so significant it not only neutralized the takeover threat, but stabilized the company for the foreseeable future. It was untraceable. A ghost in the machine. A gift from a god they didn't know existed. The news reports called it a stunning, miraculous turnaround. I saw the press conference. My father, Richard, standing at a podium, his face radiating a smug, arrogant relief. "We never lost faith," he boomed. "Sterling Industries is untouchable. Fortune, as they say, favors the bold. The universe simply knows that our family is meant to lead." The universe. He created a narrative that allowed him to be the hero. He couldn't conceive of a power greater than his own ego. It wasn't a bailout in his mind. It was destiny affirming his greatness. He saw it as a victory. I saw it as the first crack in the mirror. Next, I turned my attention to my brother, Mark. Reckless, charming, and possessed of a bottomless sense of entitlement. His entire life was a testament to the belief that consequences were for other people. I knew from my grandfather's files that he had a sickness for high-stakes poker, and I knew from discreet inquiries that he was in deep. 6 figures deep to a man who did not accept installment plans. A loan shark whose methods of collection were notoriously creative. Mark was terrified. For the first time in his life, he had encountered a problem he couldn't charm or buy his way out of. The deadline was approaching. He was making frantic, whispered phone calls, trying to leverage his family name for a loan, only to find that their secret financial troubles were already known in certain circles. The doors were closing. The night before his deadline, I made another wire transfer. Not to Mark, but directly to the loan shark. The full amount, settled. Anonymous. The message sent to the shark's enforcer was simple. The debt is paid. Forget the name. I can picture Mark's reaction perfectly. The initial wave of disbelief. The sweat on his brow, followed not by gratitude but by a sudden chilling paranoia. Who paid it? This isn't right. Is this a trap? Is someone watching me? It has to be Dad, it must be. He let me suffer to teach me a lesson, the old bastard. He's testing me. Where my father saw destiny, my brother saw conspiracy. He couldn't imagine a benevolent force in the universe, only a manipulative one. His own treacherous nature wouldn't allow it. The seeds of suspicion were planted. He would now look at our father not with respect, but with resentment, believing he was being played like a pawn in some grand paternal game. The second crack. Then, it was my mother's turn. Eleanor. A woman whose entire identity was a carefully curated facade of philanthropic grace. Her great passion was the Eleanor Sterling Foundation for Underprivileged Artists, a vanity charity that produced glossy brochures and little else. From the ledgers I had organized, I knew it was a financial sieve, a front for her extravagant lifestyle. And worse, it was about to be exposed for fraud. An ambitious local journalist was sniffing around, asking questions about where the money was actually going. An audit was looming. This intrusion had to be more personal, more ghostly. I waited until the day before the journalist's story was set to run. I calculated the exact amount needed to cover the discrepancy in the foundation's books. To the dollar. And I sent it. An anonymous donation. But I added a personal touch. A whisper from the past. On the memo line of the wire transfer, I typed 2 words. A private nickname my grandfather, her father, used to call her when she was a little girl. A name no one else knew, Ellie Bell. That, I knew, would haunt her in a way the others couldn't yet understand. Money could be explained away by luck or strategy. But a secret whispered from the grave. That was an act of God. Or something else. I imagined her alone in her office, staring at the screen, the blood draining from her face. The relief of her salvation immediately poisoned by a terrifying, superstitious dread. No one knew he called me that. It's impossible. Is this a sign? A warning? Is it him? A ghost? Punishing me for what we did to his will? For what we did to her? My father saw a sign of his own greatness. My brother saw a conspiracy. My mother saw a ghost. 3 miracles. 3 different interpretations. All of them wrong. The perfect foundation for distrust. The final piece of Act 1 was the family dinner. I wasn't there, of course, but I didn't need to be. My grandfather had a paranoid streak. The main rooms of the mansion were wired with discrete security cameras, audio and video, a system I had helped him install and maintain, a system they had forgotten all about. From my minimalist apartment, thousands of miles away, I watched them. It was a masterpiece of dysfunction. The tension was palpable. My father, gloating about his business acumen. My brother, sullen and suspicious, watching our father's every move. My mother, quiet and pale, twisting a napkin in her lap, starting at every shadow. The argument started small. A passive-aggressive comment from Mark about mysterious windfalls. Richard took the bait. It escalated quickly. Voices were raised. Accusations flew like poisoned darts across the table. It was one of your partners trying to buy influence. Mark shouted at Richard. Don't be a fool, Richard shot back. This was a sign of confidence in my leadership. Something you know nothing about. It's a warning, Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. It's father. I know it. They dismissed her as hysterical. Only Chloe, my quiet, observant sister, the one most like me, seemed to grasp the edges of the truth. I watched her watch them, her face a mask of contempt. They're all fools. Every one of them. This isn't luck and it isn't a ghost. Someone is playing a game with us. A very, very clever game. And whoever it is, they're just getting started. I watched until they stormed away from the table, the illusion of family unity shattered. The news report on one of my monitors was celebrating their miraculous corporate turnaround. They called it a miracle. I called it an investment. I picked up my tablet and approved another transaction. A small one this time. Just enough to cover the property taxes on the mansion they thought they owned. Every dollar I gave them bought me a piece of their sanity. Soon I would own it all. My opening salvo was complete. The initial investment had matured beautifully, yielding precisely the returns I had projected: fear, suspicion, and discord. I had presented each of them, my father, my brother, my mother, with a miracle tailored to their deepest vanities and anxieties. For my father, a corporate salvation that he could attribute to his own mythic greatness. For my brother, a deliverance from his debts that felt more like a threat than a gift. And for my mother, a whisper from the grave that promised to curdle her relief into superstitious terror. I had given them exactly what they wanted, and in doing so, I had given them a poison for which there was no antidote. Watching them on those silent monitors, I saw not a family, but 3 separate competing narratives of delusion, each starring a different villain. They had a common enemy, of course, but they would never find me. They were too busy looking for the monster in the person sitting next to them. The foundation was laid. The cracks were showing. But this was just the overture. The first act was about planting seeds in fertile ground. The second act would be about cultivating the rot. The intrusions would have to become more personal now, more inexplicable, harder to dismiss as luck or coincidence. They needed to feel the walls of their own world closing in, to suspect the very air they breathed. They needed to understand on a primal level that they were no longer safe in their own home, in their own lives. They needed to feel haunted. And I, their loving, forgotten daughter, was more than happy to provide the ghosts. The second phase of my operation required a shift in tactics. The initial grand gestures had served their purpose. They had established the presence of an unknown, powerful force. Now I needed to bring that force inside their walls to make it intimate and inescapable. The financial interventions were the equivalent of a thunderclap. What I needed now was a whisper in the dark, a breath on the back of the neck. My sister Chloe was the first variable I needed to control. Unlike the others, she was not blinded by ego, paranoia, or guilt. She was intelligent, observant, and deeply cynical. She hadn't bought into the narratives of divine intervention or ghostly warnings. I saw it in the way she watched them, her expression a mixture of contempt and curiosity. She was the detective in their crumbling Gothic mansion, and if left to her own devices, she might actually uncover a thread that could lead, however indirectly, back to me. I couldn't have that. But I also couldn't simply neutralize her. She was a tool, waiting to be properly calibrated. Her intelligence wasn't a threat. It was an opportunity. I decided not to obstruct her investigation, but to guide it. To become its silent, invisible benefactor. From my remote perch, I watched her through her laptop's camera. She was meticulous. She spent hours trying to trace the source of the corporate bailout, hitting the same firewalls and dead ends I had designed. She was good, but she was working with a map I had drawn. So I began leaving her breadcrumbs. I created a new encrypted email account and sent an anonymous tip to a financial journalist I knew Chloe followed, a journalist known for his aggressive anti-corporate stance. The tip was a single sentence. Ask who really benefits from the miracle at Sterling Industries. I attached a heavily redacted document, a single page from a fabricated report that hinted at a complex internal scheme. It was just enough to be intriguing, but not enough to be conclusive. The journalist published a speculative article a few days later. It was full of innuendo and pointed questions, all circling the idea that the anonymous benefactor might be an inside job. A power play by a majority shareholder to consolidate control. The article didn't name names, but it didn't have to. There was only one person who fit the profile: my father. I saw Chloe read the article. I watched her pupils dilate slightly. I saw the flicker of a new idea taking root in her mind. It was a plausible theory. It fit Richard's monstrous ego and his well-established capacity for manipulation. It recontextualized everything. Mark's debt being paid off, a way to control him, Mother's charity being saved, a way to keep her quiet and compliant. It was a perfect, self-contained conspiracy theory, and Richard was the perfect villain. I had given Chloe's brilliant mind a new puzzle to solve, a puzzle whose only solution was the one I had designed. She stopped looking for an external force. She began looking at our father. With Chloe's attention successfully redirected, I moved on to the next intrusion. This one was for Eleanor. My mother's guilt was the most fertile ground I had to work with. Her belief in ghosts was a symptom of a deeper sickness in her soul. She needed a more tangible specter. My grandfather had been a patron of the arts in his younger days. He had commissioned a portrait of himself from a moderately famous painter in the 60s. It was, by all accounts, a masterpiece of the form, capturing not just his likeness, but his intensity, his ambition, his ruthlessness. The portrait had been sold off in a private auction years ago, before my father took over the company, to cover a secret debt Richard had incurred. My grandfather never forgave him for it. The location of the portrait was a mystery, a lost piece of the family history. A mystery, that is, to everyone but the family archivist. I had the original bill of sale. I had the name of the buyer. It took me a month and a significant portion of my grandfather's hidden fortune, but I tracked it down. It was sitting in a private collection in Geneva. I bought it through another shell corporation, of course. The price was astronomical, but its value to my project was incalculable. I arranged for its delivery. Not in a crate, not through a fine art shipping company. I had it delivered as if from the grave itself. I hired a team to work in the dead of night. They bypassed the mansion's security system, a system I knew intimately because I had helped design it, and hung the portrait in the most dramatic location possible, at the top of the grand staircase, directly overlooking the foyer. It was the first thing anyone would see when they walked through the front door. The next morning, I tuned into the security feeds. The housekeeper's scream was the opening bell. Then my mother appeared at the bottom of the stairs. She looked up. Her hand flew to her mouth. The blood drained from her face. She didn't see a painting. She saw an accuser, my grandfather in the prime of his life, staring down at her, his eyes seeming to follow her, to judge her. The portrait wasn't just an object. It was a physical manifestation of her guilt. It was a monument to the man they had betrayed. Richard and Mark's reactions were different, but no less satisfying. Richard saw it as an acquisition. My God, he blustered, someone must have returned it. A gesture of goodwill. This is a sign that the sterling name is ascendant once again. He couldn't conceive of it as anything other than a tribute to himself. Mark just saw another move in a game he didn't understand. Who did this? How? The security system wasn't tripped. This isn't normal. This is a message, a threat. Is someone telling us they can get inside anytime they want? The portrait broke something in my mother. She began talking to it, whispering apologies when she thought no one was around. She started leaving flowers at the base of the staircase. The house was no longer just a house. It was a tomb, and she was being haunted by its king. Chloe, now viewing everything through the lens of our father's treachery, saw the portrait as a calculated move. A psychological weapon wielded by Richard to unsettle their mother, to keep her off balance. Every new intrusion only served to confirm the false reality I had built for her. While the family was reeling from their new houseguest, I initiated the most complex phase of my plan, the infiltration of Sterling Industries. The company was my father's heart. It was the source of his power and his identity. To control it was to control him. But I couldn't do it from the outside. I needed a man on the inside. I created him from whole cloth. Mr. Alistair Nightingale. A name that sounded both respectable and vaguely predatory. I built him a legend, a reclusive, semi-retired corporate strategist, a turnaround artist who only worked with a select elite clientele. He had no social media presence, no public footprint. His reputation was spread only by word of mouth in the highest circles of finance. A ghost. My kind of ghost. The man I hired to play Nightingale was a former British intelligence officer I found through a discreet agency that specialized in such things. He was a master of disguise and psychological manipulation. He was also, for the right price, intensely loyal. I gave him a mission: get hired by Richard Sterling, become his most trusted advisor, and then, under the guise of helping him, run his company into the ground. Nightingale's approach was a masterclass in seduction. He didn't apply for a job. He arranged a chance encounter at an exclusive cigar lounge my father frequented. He dropped a few carefully chosen names, made a few uncannily accurate predictions about the market. He presented himself as a man who had nothing to prove and nothing to sell. He was exactly what my father's ego needed, a brilliant, enigmatic figure who recognized Richard's own genius. Richard was hooked. He pursued Nightingale, not the other way around. He offered him an obscene amount of money to come on as a consultant. Nightingale played reluctant, then finally accepted, on the condition that he report only to Richard. He was to be a secret weapon. Nightingale's reports to me were a joy to read. He described in precise clinical detail the process of dismantling my father's confidence. He would present Richard with two strategies. One, a sound, sensible plan that would lead to modest, sustainable growth. The other, a high-risk, high-reward gamble that appealed directly to Richard's vanity and his desire for a spectacular, headline-grabbing victory. Nightingale would subtly endorse the sensible plan, knowing that Richard, in his arrogance, would always choose the opposite. He wanted to be the bold one, the visionary, so he did. He poured money into speculative ventures Nightingale had designed to fail. He approved marketing campaigns that were exercises in pure hubris, alienating their core customer base. He initiated a series of aggressive, ill-advised acquisitions that stretched the company's finances to the breaking point. And at every step, Nightingale was there, whispering in his ear, "A bold move, Richard. A lesser man would have hesitated, but you see the bigger picture." Richard became completely dependent on Nightingale. He saw him not as an employee, but as the only other mind on his level. He shared everything with him. The company's secrets, his frustrations with his family, his growing contempt for his paranoid, reckless son. Nightingale fed all of it back to me. I had a direct line into my father's mind. Meanwhile, my brother was spiraling. The salvation from his gambling debt hadn't taught him a lesson. It had just made him more reckless. He was convinced he was playing with house money, that some invisible safety net would always appear. But the paranoia I had planted was also growing. He started seeing threats everywhere. He became obsessed with the idea that he was being followed, that his phone was tapped. I decided to give his paranoia some substance. I hired a private investigator, not to investigate Mark, but to be seen by him. A generic-looking man in a gray sedan parked down the street from his apartment. A glimpse of the same man in a restaurant. Nothing overt, just enough to make him feel the walls closing in. He started drinking heavily. He missed meetings. His behavior at the office became erratic. He picked fights with our father, accusing him of having him followed. Richard, of course, denied it, seeing it as more evidence of Mark's instability. "You're losing it, son," Richard would say, his voice dripping with disappointment. "Maybe you should take some time off." Mark saw the suggestion not as a kindness, but as a threat, an attempt to push him out. He became convinced that our father, with the help of the mysterious Mr. Nightingale, was trying to have him declared incompetent so they could seize his shares in the company. His paranoia was no longer just a feeling. It had a narrative. And in that narrative, our father was the villain. His relationship with Richard, already strained, became openly hostile. Their arguments, which I monitored through Nightingale's reports, were vicious. The final piece of the second act was to bring all of this cultivated misery to a head. Another family dinner. A year, almost to the day after the will reading. The atmosphere wasn't just tense. It was radioactive. I watched on the security feeds. My father, puffed up with a false confidence instilled by Nightingale, presided over the table like a tin pot dictator. My mother, gaunt and pale, sat picking at her food, her eyes darting constantly towards the portrait of my grandfather, which loomed over them from the top of the stairs. Mark was visibly drunk, his eyes red-rimmed and full of a wild, cornered animal fear. And Chloe sat in perfect, watchful silence, her gaze shifting between Mark and Richard, analyzing their every move. Convinced she was witnessing a civil war of her father's own making, the catalyst was, as I had planned, Nightingale. Richard couldn't stop talking about him. Alistair says this. Alistair and I are planning that. He was holding up his relationship with this stranger as a model of loyalty and brilliance. A stark contrast to the failures and weaknesses of his own son. Mark finally snapped. He lurched to his feet, knocking over a glass of wine. The red stain spread across the white tablecloth like a pool of blood. "Alistair!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Is that who you're replacing me with? Is he the one you've hired to watch me? To drive me crazy so you can take everything?" "Don't be absurd," Richard sneered, his face a mask of contempt. "I don't need to drive you crazy. You're doing a fine job of that on your own. You're a liability, a drunk, a failure. It's the house. My mother suddenly cried out, her voice a thin, reedy wail. It's father's ghost. He's angry with us. The portrait? He's watching us. He's doing all of this to punish us. Richard slammed his fist on the table. Enough of your superstitious nonsense, Eleanor. There are no ghosts. There is only incompetence. He turned back to Mark. You're out. As of tomorrow, you're on an indefinite leave of absence. Nightingale will be taking over your duties. That was it. The final break. Mark lunged across the table at our father. It wasn't a fight. It was a pathetic, drunken scramble. Security had to be called to pull them apart. Mark was dragged from the room shouting obscenities, threats, accusations. Eleanor collapsed into hysterics, sobbing about curses and vengeful spirits. Richard stood there, straightening his tie, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and triumph. He had finally excised the weakness from his family. Chloe was the only one who remained calm. She simply stood up, looked at our father with an expression of pure, unadulterated loathing, and said, You did this. All of it. You've destroyed us. Then she turned and walked out, leaving Richard alone in the magnificent, silent dining room, the victor of a war no one else knew they were fighting. I closed the video feed. My plan had worked perfectly. They were broken. They had turned on each other with a ferocity I could never have matched. They had become the monsters I had always known them to be. Their trust in each other was shattered. Their love, if it ever existed, was dead. I had given them everything they thought they wanted: money, power, freedom from consequence, and they had used it to build their own private hells. But as I sat there, in the quiet of my apartment, the silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of an empty battlefield. The silence after the screaming stops. I had won, but the victory felt cold. It felt like ash. I had set out to be a mirror to show them their own ugliness. But I had spent so long staring into that mirror, I wasn't sure what I was seeing anymore. I had one final act to play, one final gift to bestow. But for the first time, a sliver of doubt, sharp and cold as ice, pierced the armor of my certainty. What, I wondered, would be left of me when it was all over? The second act was an exercise in applied psychology. The grand external shocks of the first act had served their purpose. They established a presence, a force my family could not comprehend. But to truly dismantle them, I had to move the battle from the boardroom to the psyche. I had to become a ghost in their own home, a whisper in their own minds. My goal was no longer just to create chaos, but to meticulously cultivate it, to nurture the seeds of their own worst natures until they choked out everything else. I turned my observant sister Chloe from a potential threat into an unwitting pawn, feeding her a narrative that cast our father as the master manipulator, a lie she readily believed because it fit the contours of her own resentment. For my mother, I resurrected a literal ghost from the past, our grandfather's portrait, a silent, painted judge that became the focal point for her suffocating guilt. It transformed her grief into a waking nightmare. Then came my masterpiece, Alistair Nightingale, a phantom I created from smoke and whispers, who became my father's most trusted confidant and ultimately the architect of his ruin. Through him, I controlled the heart of their kingdom, Sterling Industries, and had a direct line into the decay of my father's mind. I gave my brother's paranoia a face, a shadow to chase, until his fear curdled into a self-fulfilling prophecy of addiction and madness. The final dinner was not a confrontation. It was a detonation. I simply lit the fuse and watched from a safe distance as they tore each other apart, their accusations and hatred echoing in that grand, empty room. The victory was absolute. They were broken, not by me, but by the weight of their own greed, guilt, and arrogance. I had held up the mirror and they had shattered it. But in the silence that followed, watching the wreckage on my screens, I felt a profound and chilling emptiness. I had won, but the cost was becoming clear. I had set out to destroy the monsters, but I had spent so long in the dark with them, I was beginning to forget the sun. There is a concept in engineering called catastrophic failure. It's when a structure, pushed beyond its limits, doesn't just break, it disintegrates. The collapse is sudden, total, and irreversible. My family was such a structure, built on a foundation of lies, held together by the rotting mortar of pride. I had spent a year methodically applying stress to every load-bearing point. Now it was time for the final decisive pressure, the final gift. The vehicle for this final gift was, of course, Alistair Nightingale. He had spent months convincing my father to consolidate the company's remaining liquid assets and leverage its credit to the absolute maximum for one enormous, visionary project. It was a deal involving the acquisition of a series of obscure biotech patents. Nightingale presented it to Richard as a legacy-defining move, a gamble so audacious that it would not only erase their recent losses, but catapult the sterling name into the stratosphere for generations. It was in reality a meticulously designed black hole. The patents were worthless. The company they were acquiring was a shell, another of my creations, designed to absorb their capital and then vanish. I watched Richard's final board meeting via the hidden camera in Nightingale's lapel pin. My father, haggard and aged by the stress of the past year, but with a manic, feverish light in his eyes. He was a gambler placing his very last chip. He overrode the cautious objections of the few remaining sane members of his board with a speech full of blustering, empty rhetoric about courage and destiny. Fortune favors the bold, his favorite cliché. He signed the papers. A single stroke of a pen, authorizing the transfer of hundreds of millions of dollars into a void of my creation. It was the largest transaction in the company's history. It was also its suicide note. The collapse took 3 days. The news broke on a Tuesday. The shell company, having received the funds, dissolved. The patents were revealed to be fraudulent. Sterling Industries was not just bankrupt. It was a crater. The stock price went to zero. The creditors, the banks, the partners they had screwed over for decades, they descended like wolves. The company my grandfather had built over a lifetime was dismantled for parts in less than a week. Nightingale vanished, of course. His contract terminated, his legend intact, his final report to me a simple 2-word message. Task complete. I gave them 1 week to live inside their ruin. 1 week for the reality to sink in. Then I initiated the final phase. The foreclosure. You see, over the past year, as I anonymously paid their bills and bailed out their company, I wasn't just giving them money. I was buying their debt. Every mortgage payment, every line of credit I covered was done through a series of trusts and holding companies that I controlled. The mansion they lived in, the cars they drove, the art on their walls, they thought they owned it. In truth, for months, I had been their sole creditor. I owned them. The eviction notice was served on a Friday morning. I didn't have to be there. The cameras were still active. I watched as a bewildered-looking process server handed the papers to my mother at the grand front door. I watched as her face crumpled, not in anger, but in a kind of exhausted spiritual surrender. She looked up at the portrait of my grandfather as if to say, I know. This is your judgment. She didn't even fight. She simply went upstairs to pack a small bag, a ghost willingly departing her own haunting. Richard's reaction was the one I had been waiting for. He didn't rage. He didn't scream. He just broke. He stood in the foyer, reading the legal documents, his hands trembling. He saw the names of the trusts, the intricate web of ownership, and in that moment, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place in his shattered mind. The bailout, the portrait. Mark's paranoia, Nightingale. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a conspiracy from a rival. It was a single, unified, impossibly patient plan. He didn't know who, not yet. But he understood the how. He understood that his miracles had been his undoing, that his savior and his destroyer were the same entity. The realization didn't just ruin him. It erased him. He collapsed, a massive, debilitating stroke, right there at the foot of the grand staircase, under the cold, painted eyes of his father. The master of the universe, felled by a piece of paper, Mark was long gone. After being thrown out, he had cashed out the last of his personal funds and disappeared into a haze of drugs and alcohol. The news of the collapse would have reached him as a distant rumor, another betrayal in a life he now saw as a conspiracy against him. He was a ghost of a different sort, haunting the fringes of a life he no longer had access to. And Chloe, my clever, cynical sister. She was the only one who figured it out. A week after the foreclosure, I received a single encrypted email. The sender was anonymous, but I knew it was her. It contained no text, just an attachment, a photograph of a first-class one-way plane ticket. The same kind I had been given. It was her way of saying, I know it was you. And I understand why. It was not forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement, a sign of respect from one survivor to another. Then she too vanished. off to build a life free from the wreckage of the Sterling name. The house is mine now. I walk through its empty, silent rooms sometimes. It's not a trophy. It's a museum. A museum dedicated to the cost of a single cruel laugh. I look at my grandfather's portrait, at the eyes that seem to hold both pride and a terrible sadness. He wanted me to be free. I wonder if this is what he meant. My revenge is complete. It was a masterpiece of architecture, a perfectly executed plan. I took everything from them. Their money, their pride, their sanity, their name. I did it without ever raising my voice, without ever showing my face. I became the moral mirror I intended to be, but the thing about a mirror is that in the end, it shows you your own reflection. I look at my life now. The quiet, sterile apartment. The screens that show numbers and data instead of faces. The silence. I set out to prove I was nothing like them, but I learned their language. The language of assets and leverage, of psychological warfare, of cold, dispassionate calculation. I won the war by becoming the most ruthless Sterling of them all. They gave me a plane ticket and laughed, because they thought a quiet girl couldn't survive in their world. They were right. She didn't. In the end, the revenge was absolute. A family destroyed not by an attacker, but by a moral mirror that forced them to see their own greed, guilt, and arrogance. She won, but as she stood alone in that vast, empty house, the victory felt as cold and empty as the silence that surrounded her. Thank you so much for sticking with this incredible story to the end. This narrative was a masterclass in psychological warfare. What part of Jessica's plan did you find the most ruthless? Was it the ghostly portrait she had hung on the grand staircase? Or the complete fabrication of the ultimate phantom consultant, Alistair Nightingale? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this breakdown, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. We unpack complex narratives like this every single week, so if you haven't already, subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a file from the archive. And finally, if you want to support the channel further and get access to exclusive content, you can check out our membership options by clicking the Join button. Until next time, stay curious and always read the fine print.